On behalf of the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive, the Northern Pacific Historical Association, and virtual rail fan Chehalis, Washington, welcome to tonight's event. A couple of quick housekeeping items. Please keep your mic on mute. Please use our chat. We can chat all we want and submit your questions. We will do some questions and answers at the end of tonight's program. In yesteryear, railroads provided dining facilities for their workers, passengers, and the public at locations where train crews congregated and where passengers boarded. These restaurants were colloquially known as beaneries. They were open 24/7 at strategically vital locations for food before, during, and after shifts on the railroad. This informal setting provided time for food and folklore, solid meals, and interesting company. In an informal setting, our ancestors ate, talked, swapped tales, lamented the past, and looked forward to the future. Welcome, everybody, to our 21st century beanery. Using the magic of science, we are traveling back in time tonight to the middle of the 20th century, where railroaders' tales of yesteryear are swapped about at our virtual lunch counter. Tonight, we have as our special guest, Jack Christensen, retired Northern Pacific and Burlington Northern engineer. John Henry Jack Christensen, seen on the left here, an Auburn, Washington native, was born June 16, 1926. His father was a boomer machinist who'd come to the Northern Pacific at Auburn from the Great Northern at Whitefish, Montana. Jack's father was blacklisted by the GN in Whitefish, resulting from the 1922 shopman strike. The NP considered his father's skills superior to his prior problems. Jack's career began as an engine wiper, a laborer, on June 27, 1942. His youthful start was due to the shortage of able workers due to World War II. Over the next 2 years, young Jack worked as a supply boy, crew caller, fire cleaner, and hostler helper at Auburn. Because of the severe shortage of workers, Jack hired on as a fireman on November 1st, 1944, even though he was waiting for call-up in the Army Air Force. Shortly thereafter, Jack was called up to the Army Air Force on December 1st, 1944. Jack returned to engine service after his time in the military and attended the University of Washington by day while switching for the NP at night. Later, he was promoted to engineer in January 1955 and became road foreman of engines at Duluth, Minnesota in October 1965. From there, Jack served the NP at Minneapolis, 1967, and Livingston, Montana in 1970. Jack returned to engine service with the BN in Seattle in September 1972. He retired July 7th, 1999, with 57 years and 8 days of service.
Can you hear him?
Les, some of the interruptions we've mentioned.
You hear him, okay.
Yeah.
Jack has written a number of stories about his railroad career for the Northern Pacific Historical Association magazine, The Main Streeter. Since the 1950s, Jack has pursued watercolor painting with primarily railroad and marine subjects. Today's talk is about Jack's memories of driving trains on the third subdivision of the Northern Pacific between Tacoma and Vancouver. Please join with me in giving a warm welcome to Jack Christensen. Hi, Jack. How are you? Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah. I still don't have my mic and earplugs, but we can get along without them. I don't know. It's one of those things.
We're just going to have to wing it.
Oh, yeah. Well, as long as you can hear me and I can hear you, it's fine.
Great. Well, Jack, here's a picture I want us to talk about to start out our program for tonight. This is one of your paintings, and this was one of your first nights as an engineer, as I recall?
Well, this is a midnight class. That was a job at the south end of the Auburn yard that made up the trains for everything going north to Sumas, Bellingham, Everett. And the midnight job, Christmas night of 1943, I was called as they used laborers out of the roundhouse during the war in the yard only. And some of my friends in the roundhouse also as firemen. We didn't get a seniority date and we could not go out on the road. We weren't really firemen. This one night, there was Christmas night, and the engineer had too much Christmas cheer, I guess. And he needed somebody to run the engine for an hour. I didn't even know the signals. I had to go stand behind him, and he taught me the 4 signals, all we needed to know. And I remember running the engine for about an hour that Christmas night. And we went to beans, the switch, and didn't say anything. I guess I did all right. So I had my first experience as an engineer at the age of 17, but it didn't count.
I know. So Jack, before we get going too far, I just want to take a minute for people that may not be familiar with the area. And I just want to share a couple of slides, and then we're going to look at some more of your paintings. Here, for example, is the Centralia to Napaville portion of the Seattle to Portland 3rd subdivision. So I just wanted people to kind of see this geographically will generally be the area that we're going to be talking about today. And I wanted to kind of give people some background there. And then here is a timetable from 1942. And we've got a number of interesting things on here, Jack. We've got, for example, where all the water stops were for you during the steam era, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And we've got some other trains on here. We've got 401 and 402, which was the night NP passenger train. And you were able to hold that train sometimes, weren't you?
Well, we worked, I worked a bit as a fireman. I worked the midnight Northern Pacific train. That was 401 and 2. And the Great Northern had a train, and the Union Pacific had a train. 458 was the Union Pacific. 408 was our premier train, the day train. And I think 562 was the Great Northern. And
right, and it's interesting, Jack, because when we look at this timetable, that we can see that the Great Northern train back then was still using the true prairie line from Tacoma to Tenino. And the 422 used the American Lakes line. And Jack, wasn't that the train that went out to Aberdeen and Hoquiam?
Yeah, that was really a nice train. We had 2 crews, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. They didn't run Sunday. He went down and back in one day. So he had 2 days, 130-mile pay. It was all daylight work. It took a lot of seniority to work, and I was able to hold it for a short time in the late 50s.
Because being from the Seattle Auburn area, you guys didn't work as much south of Tacoma because of the division of the miles. How did that division work? Because you didn't work down here that much as a result of it, right?
Well, the line to Portland, the through trains that ran Seattle to Portland and Seattle out to Hoquiam, the Seattle district was Seattle North with all the branch lines, a line over to Yakima. And the Tacoma district was Tacoma South with the branch lines to out to Raymond on South Bend, Hoquiam, Oak Cliffs, Yakima branch. Seniority districts are very territorial. So the trains that ran through, they had to divide the miles proportionally. So the Tacoma district on the through trains to Portland, they own 78% of the mileage, and we own 22%. We had 40 miles and they had 148. So we had to divide the jobs proportionally. So we shared that runs that went over 2 seniority districts had to be apportioned out proportional to the mileage.
Okay, so that's why you didn't get down here that often. So let's move along to here's a couple of pictures of 401. It's very rare because this was a night train, so it would only be in summer that you would be able to catch it in Tacoma. So Jack, we got a busy train here today, don't we, this morning?
Yeah, well, most of my experience before the merger on the south end was on that particular train. It took a lot of seniority to hold those jobs. These, as a fireman, you were right on the verge of being promoted to engineer to hold one of those firing. I was able to hold it several times. The longest time is in the early 60s, from February and March. I think I held the job for 6 weeks. We just happened to be the Seattle district owned that train for a while. I was able to work it, but I got most of my experience before the merger on that particular train. You very seldom got a chance at the freight jobs down there in the early days.
Now, another thing about this train, Jack, is all the head end that, unlike the day trains, this night train had a lot of mail and express and baggage and stuff, right?
Yeah, we had a very slow schedule, but we had 15 stops, regular stops, and 5 flag stops each direction. And a 6-7 hour running time seemed pretty slow, but you had to run those locomotives as fast as you could to stay on time. For instance, we were allowed 20 minutes at Centralia for baggage and mail. And I can remember being an hour loading fish in a express refrigerator. So you'd come in on time and leave 40 minutes late. And of course, during the war years, this was a regular thing. And even afterwards, there was a lot of what we would call head-end traffic, baggage, express, even fruit and fish.
So this is one of your paintings, Jack, and it's unique because who's in it?
Well, I did that painting for one of our conventions. That's me, I guess, taking water up there on the 2602.
Which was one of your favorite locomotives, wasn't it?
Well, they were the first passenger engines with 8 drivers. In fact, they named them after the Northern Pacific. All wheel arrangements had a name. That wheel arrangement was named the Northern after the Northern Pacific. And it was introduced in 1926, the same year I was born. They built 11 of these, and other railroads followed suit right away. It became very popular, and they were especially good because they could use them on either passenger or freight. They were fast, and they still had a great pulling power. But
you needed to make sure that they were full of water, right? Because they didn't have the biggest tenders in the world.
Our first order of 12 engines in 1926 had 15,000 gallon tanks. And with a heavy train, it was a pretty close call to get to Centralia for water. That was the halfway point between Seattle and Portland. And you didn't want to run out of water on a steam engine. So we would make sure at Seattle when you went on duty that the boiler was as full as you dare make it. Right at the top of the water glass, and you'd go back and make sure the tender was completely full with no room for any more water. And once in a while, you'd have to go back before you got to Centralia. There was water at a place called Cairo, just about 20 miles north of Centralia. It was our last chance. You'd have to go back and let the spout hook down into the water and tell the engineer how much you had. We never did have to cut and run for water, but it was you had to be careful because there were a limited number of water stops. There was water at Tacoma, but it wasn't on the main line, and you couldn't go into the roundhouse with a passenger train.
So can you explain the braking system that you used to be able to get this locomotive to be able to stop at the exact right point for it to be able to take water?
Well, what made the job so difficult was the number of stops going from speed down to the spot, you had to spot the baggage car at a general location at every station. And of course, at Centralia, you had to stop the engine precisely at the water spout. And the air brake work was, there's a lot of air brake work, and it had to be done right. And it's kind of stressful. I think that's why some of us, if you did a good job as a fireman, the engineer generally got you to run the engine part-time, and because firing an oil burner was easy. You get the atomizer set for, and the dampers, all you had was a single lever to increase the oil flow when you needed more steam. And it was a pretty nice job. And the engineers would watch us over there, and they, if they thought we could do the job, we got to run the engine part of the time. And believe me, it was required a lot more precision air brake work than they had on a freight train.
So, and there was a way that you firemen could kind of charm your way with the engineers to let you drive the train once in a while. How'd you do that?
Well, I got to run the engine, and even for people from the Tacoma district. We didn't always have one from our seniority district because the unions never agreed on when to equalize the miles. So sometimes a Seattle engineer would work with a Tacoma fireman and vice versa. I got experience with both, from a Seattle engineer at first, and later on some of the Tacoma men. But yeah, it was give you a lot of experience in handling braking because of the number of stops.
Right. Yeah, this was a busy train with a lot of stops and a lot heavier than a lot of the other trains were. So 401 and 2 were a lot of work. 407 and 8 by the comparison were a vacation. And those were the day trains, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's look at some more. Here's now what's going on here, Jack?
Well, probably maybe he's got the chain caught in the spout knob or something. He can't release it, get rid of the water, but it's running over the top. They had,
well, at least we know it's full.
Yeah, 15,000 gallon tank.
Yeah. And as you told me once, they're trying to stomp it down, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, yeah, they probably takes a little kidding about that, but you wanted to get that tank full, though, because with a heavy train, you needed that to make Seattle too. He's headed north there.
Right, right.
There are very few places you could take water on the way back. Once you got, say there was nothing at Tacoma, there was water at Auburn on the main line, but you don't want to make an unscheduled stop to get water.
Right. Okay, moving along.
Yeah.
Here we've got one, Jack.
This is 400 day, of course. It's a day job. This is Biz Quality. Track in front here on the right is the line of the American Lake line. That's where Amtrak is running now. And right up that track, about a mile, is where they had the big wreck 6 years ago. So
right.
You can see Puget Sound in the background. Amtrak no longer has a scenic waterfront view from Tacoma anymore.
Yeah, a couple other things to point out about this photograph is we can see Highway 99 in the background, and we can see that this is a steam train, but it's pulling a consist of lowy schemed passenger cars. So.
Yeah. Right.
Here we are in Centralia, Jack. This looks like a UP train, huh?
Yeah, it's Union Pacific, probably 457. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an older photograph, and I noticed that the folks are on the other track from the depot track. You know, these days they try to stop the trains right next to the stations, and sometimes that can be a problem, right?
Yeah, one of my engineers I worked for was telling me when he was a fireman, he was working with the Tacoma district man on freight coming down off Napavine during the war. Everything was pretty hectic. little bit misty coming through Chehalis Junction, suddenly realized 402 was standing at the depot, and baggage carts on their track, and passengers and train crew and porters. The fireman was running in, and he says, "What do we do? What do we do?" The engineer says, "Well, you can't stop, just blow the whistle and keep going." Everybody had to scatter, nobody was hurt. Ordinarily, I suppose it'd be an investigation, but it was wartime and it was just another incident. But that was always a hazard, coming between a passenger train and depot. Even now, there is no signal protection. You have to keep the passenger train schedule in mind and avoid coming around the corner and finding them working a train in front of you.
Because back then there were no radios and no way of really knowing exactly where these people were.
Yeah, well, and a lot of times the radios between the railroads were not competitive. Even post-merger, I remember coming into Castle Rock one time and forgotten completely about the Great Northern Morning Train headed north. And fortunately, we met them out of town. They already left, but if we'd have been 5 minutes earlier, I would have been fired, I think. There's no indication of it. You had to keep it in mind.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Don't come between a passenger train and the depot.
Yeah. Well, in these days, they've got a best practice where they move the train over to the depot, unlike what they're doing here in this.
I'm going to call Ken Iverson and ask him if the dispatchers try to put Amtrak next to the depot when they can, because now it's all CTC and they can use either track. So they can put Amtrak next to the depot anytime they want.
That's right, because this was all train order territory and then 251 territory. How late was that? That was...
Well, what we had before CTC, of course, you run on the right-hand track, current of traffic. You have to have a train order to run against the current of traffic, of course. And you're governed by what we call double track rules. That was the case, of course. That line was double track all the way when I started. It was double tracked to 14, finally?
Something like that. Yeah, I saw Gary nod his head, so that's a good sign. And then after you came back to the BN, then you got to drive some Amtrak trains for a while, right?
Yeah. I was able to hold Amtrak for some time, both south and east in the 80s, until they took over in 87.
Oh, when they came up with their own seniority roster?
Pardon?
With they had their own roster of everybody went to work for Amtrak then?
Well, I could have. I just didn't like the looks of things. We had a year to make up our mind. We could come back to work after a year. My wife says, "Well, you'll have to agonize twice if you go to Amtrak." So I agonized once and stayed with the freight end of it. And I think it was the right thing to do.
Ah, that sounds great. Yeah. So, a morning train here, and this is a Walt Ainsworth photograph at Centralia in 1987, as it says. Chehalis, Jack. We're working our way south.
Well, here's Chehalis. Obviously.
Depot. A couple of things that are interesting about this photograph, of course, is right where that train order signal is, up on the side of the building there, is where now we have the virtual railfan cameras. And so people can watch trains going by at this location all the time.
Yeah.
So looks like we've got I think this says 1912. And so they've got quite a crowd here.
Yeah.
All right. And here we have another picture from the Chehalis area. This is of the McKinley stump. This again is from the Walt Ainsworth collection. And apparently President McKinley was supposed to use it, but it ended up being used by President Roosevelt. And then we've got the Union Station here for Chehalis in the background. but you didn't really work a lot of freight down on that end of the railroad until after you came back on the BN, right, Jack?
I guess, yeah.
Oh, okay. But after you came back to the BN, you'd run down here both with Amtrak and with freights on a pretty regular basis, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right. And here we have another freight picture, and we think that this is this the local, do you think, Jack?
Well, I'm just looking at it, I don't know, I bet that's going to Raymond on the South Bend branch. I got a hunch. I could be wrong though.
Because the junction for that would be just a little bit south of here at Chehalis Junction.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And then the Watchman Tower, which we thought was an interesting element of this picture. How long do you remember that being around?
Well, it seems like it was always there that he controlled the crossing gates in Chehalis. He had to watch for trains and put the gates down, apparently. That's the only function that I know
And now I know there's a proposal out there to convert some of this area into a park that could be used for, community purposes and for people that want to watch trains. So it'll be interesting to see how that property gets repurposed in the future. So here we have a joint facilities photo of the Northern Pacific, and this gives us a picture of what Chehalis looked like looking south in 1927. And I know you weren't there, Jack.
of. Well, that's some kind of an evaluation thing. It's all numbered.
Right. In the BN times, would you switch here much, or would you always switch up at Centralia?
Well, to be honest with you, I never really remember doing anything at Chehalis because I always worked the through trains and very rarely on the freights. They didn't get down there much on a freight train. So I had a lot of stops with the 401 and 2, of course, at Chehalis.
Right.
That was a regular stop, I think, and even 408 stopped at Chehalis under certain conditions. If they had revenue passengers that were going far enough or were coming from a far distant place, they could stop on flag, and it was called a conditional stop. Chehalis, I don't think 408 would stop on flag under certain conditions, but of course 401 and 2, it was regular in both directions. You hear me?
Yeah. I was just checking something, and I'm just moving forward. Yeah, I'm there for you, Jack. Don't worry.
Well, I've finally figured out how to get my earpieces working here.
No, now how did you do that?
Well, I get a lot better reception now.
Oh, good. Well, yeah, everybody is rejoicing. That's great news. So we're going to keep going in our presentation. Oop. And my screen just froze. Isn't that great? So, well, Jack, tell us some more stories quick while I'm trying to figure out why this thing isn't working.
Oh, is it something not working, you say?
Yeah, my screen is frozen up for a second. So just while I'm getting my screen to work, why don't you tell me a story? There we go. Hey, I got the screen to work. Tell me about these locomotives.
Well, I don't know. This is post-merger, of course. Got a couple of Alco 636s on the point there. The SP&S bought some of those. They bought also 4-axle Alcos, 424s, 425s. Those 636s were equal to our SD45s, and I think probably even a little more muscle. They certainly could handle the tonnage. I see they got an EMD covered wagon there, but we did get those after the merger, and they on the south end. I like to run them, those Alcos. They're very reliable. This, of
They
course,
really pulled, didn't they?
No, yes, they did. Here, that track in the foreground there is where the Milwaukee came onto the, what's now the BN. And that track they also used to get to the South Bend branch, because the first 12 miles from Chehalis Junction to Dryad Junction, they shared with the Northern Pacific. And from Dryad Junction, they had their own line to South Bend. But that was where the Milwaukee entered BN track. And of course, after the merger, they obtained trackage rights to run trains all the way to Portland.
Right. So yeah, I remember you like these Alcos. You like them a little better than the SD45s, right?
Well, the SD45s, they had kind of a, I know the engineers liked them. One guy on the St. Paul division, he called them the Cadillac of locomotives, but they had a 20-cylinder engine, and they were constantly troubled with crankshafts breaking. They were a troublesome engine. Then we got the SD40, which is kind of like our steam engine, the W3s. They were the workhorse of the railroad. I think of all the freight engines I operated, I think the SD40 was all in all the best, most reliable. We had a lot of them too.
Yeah, and used them everywhere. And so you mainly were out on the main line. You didn't do a lot of local stuff then.
Well, most of the work of the South End, no, we Tacoma, Centralia, Longview Junction have main points of working on the South End.
Now, didn't you mention to me that the Northern Pacific liked having oil-fired steam locomotives out here?
Well, I don't think if Portland had an ordinance against it. I know that we did not run any coal to Portland that I know of. And I have a list of mics of like the W3s, which is our workhorse engine. They were quite a number of them. We had 135 of those things, 130s. And of all those engines, there was about 16 of them of those 136 were oil burners. And I've got a list of them, and I can remember the engine numbers. Quite a few of them were at Tacoma. Everything out of Tacoma that I ever saw that ran south of Tacoma was an oil burner. We had a couple of, the only coal burners were the little passenger engines we had to go from Tacoma to East Auburn and back. That picture of Max King and I, that was one of the few coal burners. They were strictly for the passenger connections going north. But everything ran south out of Tacoma was in oil.
Even stuff that went out to Raymond and stuff that went out to Aberdeen and Hoquiam.
Well, that I don't know, but you look at the pictures. I think they were. I really never studied Jimmy Frederick's pictures that close, but they could have used coal out anywhere as long as they weren't going to Portland. There may have been coal burners out of Tacoma, but we never saw very many of them.
So did you start out when you first started then, were you hand firing locomotives?
How was that?
Did you hand fire
locomotives? The 2194, the Q4s, they were hand fired, yeah.
Okay. So that kept you in shape, I bet.
Well, they weren't that much work, when you're only 18 or 20 years old. The helpers out of Auburn were the Q4s, they were hand fired. Auburn to Leicester was 43 miles, an hour and 15 minutes, and 4 tons of rosin coal.
We'll have to, one of our next get-togethers, we'll have to take a trip over Stampede Pass.
This is kind of out of the scope of our inquiry, but I wrote articles on the Main Streeter about firing hand-fired engines.
Did you?
Yeah.
So tell me more.
Well, like I say, East Auburn to Leicester was an hour and 15 minutes, and then they put a mountain helper crew with a W3, a bike engine. So we only went to Leicester. During the war, number 2 had several sections, sometimes as high as 6. They almost always took helpers. We'd go up to Leicester, turn the engine, and wait till all the helpers were there and couple them up and deadhead back to Auburn. Everybody but one engine and run. Well, the front engine handled the air and stayed awake, and the rest of us slept. But that was a regular thing. And we'd use W3s as helpers. But that's kind of far away from Chehalis, isn't it?
No, I know. So here, now we're getting a little bit back into that neck of the woods, and we've got, what train is this, Jack, and where are we?
Well, this is obviously, this looks like 408 at Napavine, am I right?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty darn good guess, Jack. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the day train, and there's a little bit of head end stuff on here, but not like the head end stuff like
Yeah.
we saw on your night trains.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to take a couple more pictures. This is 1945 and a Jim Frederickson photo from our collection. And here we've got looking south at Napavine. And the interesting thing here, of course, is the letter B, just to the right of the telephone pole. It looks like we've got a mixed train at the depot stopped in this photograph.
Right.
So just kind of an interesting thing there. And then we're going to jump ahead to another picture. Here's another joint facilities photo of Napavine, and we can see a number of different things here, Jack. There's a siding here, right?
Well, the track in the foreground is the what we call the westward siding. It's northbound, actually. And apparently there's industrial spurs off of the westward siding. And then to the right of that, it's the northbound main and westward main, and far track is the south or eastward. See, south was east and north was west in those days, because leaving Seattle, the trains going south could turn at Auburn and go east. So they were designated timetable eastward and timetable westward, even though they were going south and north. Then they reversed it during the merger, after the merger. So now south is southbound is well, they're even numbered, you know. So technically, southbound is westward and northbound is eastward.
So back in the back before it was CTC, Jack,
Yeah.
you'd have to get out of the way because somebody wanted to get, another train wanted to get past you. Didn't you have, how did you guys get out of the way?
Well, we backed across because
Okay, so like at figure 6, you guys would have backed across that?
the Northern Pacific did not like what we call facing point switch, where you line it and head across. They like to have the switch points trailing, what we call trailing point crossover. You can see one up there just beyond the depot where those cars run the siding. Just
Right.
to the left of that floor, there's a crossover from one main to the other. And what they would do is back across, and then they could, the front of the train would be some distance down the other track, and they'd put a flagman out there, line the switches, and if nobody showed up on the other track, you could back across, let a following train go by. Sometimes the dispatcher would put out a message to allow so-and-so to pass you. But the conductors are very reluctant to do that. But
Sometimes they don't always get that message.
if you had to clear a passenger train, of course, they got too close, you'd have to back across it. You were required, you had a message when you got a double track clearance headed south from Tacoma, you pick it up at McCarver Street, we'd get a clearance number to Centralia and maybe a handful of train orders, slow orders or whatnot, and a message, clear first-class trains on time. So it was up to the engineer and conductor to see to it that they cleared the first-class trains.
Yes, but here we have a siding, so you could, in this case, you could pull out onto that siding to get out of the way too.
Yeah, if you had a siding that would hold you, of course, you had the option to head in on the siding.
Yeah,
But he might instruct you to clear them at a certain point where there was no siding too, but there'd be crossovers to back across. And the crossovers were indicated also in the timetable.
right. Yeah, we looked at that timetable a little bit earlier today.
Yeah.
So now here's an interesting painting of yours, Jack.
Yeah, that's one. I did 2 versions of that. I think that's the one that I gave to Harold Borovic. Shows his little engine 15 at Chehalis Junction. It's strictly a make-believe picture, but like he would be heading out onto the main line and 407 heading north with a steam train.
Is that, and that's Harold in the picture, isn't it? With that signature checkerboard hat?
Yeah, well, I don't know about that. That'd be Harold, yeah. I had a good photograph of that place. The milepost was right where it is between. There was a Y there actually. That's Chehalis Junction.
Right.
The milepost 59. See, Chehalis, I think is milepost 60, 62. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, that's just about a mile from Chehalis. And it just shows, it's, as I say, it's a fictional situation. But I did that for the convention several years ago.
The NP convention that was in Chehalis.
Right. Well,
Right.
Yeah, we actually were up in Olympia, but theoretically it wasn't Centralia or Chehalis that year, yeah.
Okay, I've got another picture, I think, from the same convention coming up next.
Yeah, there's a picture of a rear end helper on Napa Vine. The signal on the right is at stop. It's milepost 64.3. So the nearest 10th, it was being as it's a southbound train, they changed, as I tell you, the direction between north and south had been changed. Ordinarily, a southbound train eastward would have an even number for the nearest 10th. But they had changed the direction of these signals. Dave Sproul can give you the background on that. But anyway, that's milepost 64. The yellow card underneath the signal arm is what we call a permissive marker. You're on a 1% grade there. That permissive marker tells you that you can pass that signal and stop without stopping. Otherwise, red signal, you got to stop and go. The idea was if you stop the train, you might not be able to get it started. In other words, you'd be lugging a heavy, any place you had a hard pull, they would put a permissive marker. We call them tonnage board, that little yellow card with a black border.
Right.
That helper's on the rear end. He had built-in markers on the tender, which are showing red to the rear. In a few car lengths, the train's picking up speed. The front end's already on the level track at Napa Vine. The train coming at you on the other track is right at the south end of the westward siding.
Now, can you explain to me how you could cut the helper off on the fly?
And of course, when they got to the speed was picking up, the rear brakeman would go, he had a rod to turn the angle cock on the caboose. He turned the angle cock on the helper engine first. The rod was long enough to reach the helper engine, the valve on the helper engine to disconnect the air brake system. Then he turned the angle cock on the caboose, which would drain the hoses. He didn't drain that first, otherwise it'd set the brakes on the helper. So once he had both angle cocks closed, he would give the signal. He'd pull the pin on the caboose, the coupler pin, and signal the helper engineer to ease off on the throttle. And they just cut off and let the slack out, and the train would be gone. Cut off on the fly. The helper would either go to Napavine for orders or drop back to Centralia, depending on what they've been instructed to do.
So is the Napavine Hill, Jack, is that tougher southbound or northbound?
Well, southbound was just a hair over 1% in some places. Northbound, it was 0.9. It was very short, pretty easy going north through Winlock.
It was like between Winlock and Eveline is that northbound grade, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was not quite as steep, but a very short stretch of steep track.
So I'm intrigued by this painting still, because you've got these markers on the back of the helper locomotive. Just tell me a little bit more about those.
Well, that particular engine was equipped with, they're on a hinge or on a door there, and they close that door and latch it when they're not using rear end markers. If it wasn't equipped with that, there's a couple of little brackets on the back of the tender. There's a couple more brackets up next to the doghouse. They'd have a couple of markers, old-fashioned markers that fit in the brackets with that were lit up with, they were kerosene. And if they had a rear helper, well, the conductor pilot would light those and put them in the brackets. This particular engine had built-in brackets.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I'd never seen that before, and I thought that was just a very interesting detail.
Yeah.
So here we are back at Auburn. And so we're coming to the end of our presentation. We've got a few more images, folks. And so if any of you have any questions out there for Jack, now would be a great time to submit those. Otherwise, we're going to be wrapping up around the top of the hour. So tell us about this painting of yours, Jack.
Oh, this is kind of a fictional thing. It's eastbound train. It probably should have a helper on it, but it could be a single Malley for Yakima. Auburn's got a little snow. That's the long lead in Auburn Yard. Head brakeman's walking up to line the switch. You can see a switch engine in the distance working on the short lead. Tracks 1 through 8 were on the short lead, and 8 through 17 the long lead. The
Now, wasn't this one of your favorite locomotives? I'm being facetious.
Yeah, those are our Z3 Malleys. They call them Sows, built during World War I, and they were slow and rough riding, and pretty miserable to work on. And when the NP bought new engines, they generally give them the St. Paul division. Every division shoved their oldest and poorly maintained engines back one division west, so that Tacoma would get what was left over. But when the diesels came, the FT 4 units, they needed more power through Stampede Tunnel than these old engines could provide. And so for once we got the new engines first. The FT diesels, of course, that was the beginning of the diesel age. It came in 1942, and I only fired one of those engines once, westbound from Yakima. We were in every siding they owned, and we never did make Auburn in 16 hours. I think we tied up at Leicester. Pretty miserable thing to work on, but that's all we had from First World War until 1942.
So then, Jack, how would you used to, when you were a fireman, there was a way that you could get in good with the engineer. How would you do that?
Well, if the engineers let you run the engine, which most of them, if you did a good job, most of them were pretty good about that. And most of us would get enough experience, and either by the engineers telling the road foreman we were okay, or one trip when I was working passenger to Yakima, the engineers changed at Ellensburg then, and we used to Yakima. Anyway, the engineer got on the train and I would run it part way.
Yeah.
He had the road foreman with him and said, he told me, well, you start tonight. And Well, I ended up running it all the way to Seattle, and the road foreman, after a few critical remarks, said, well, you're okay for passenger to first subdivision of Yakima. By the time we were actually set up as engineers, most of us were qualified on everything. If you weren't, you had to be, and on the extra board, if a job came up you weren't qualified for, they'd run around you, take the engineer behind you. If they didn't have a road foreman to go with you, you couldn't claim any penalty time for it, but most of us managed to be qualified for road service.
So when you were getting ready to go on duty, like for example, on a train like this, wouldn't the firemen go up there and spruce up the cab and do all that for the engineer?
Well, yeah, you had to suck up to the engineer, you'd hose down the deck with steam and water, and you could eat off those steel decks, and have lumps of waste by the engineer's brake valve and brass shined up. Of course, everything, water and sand checked, everything done, and be able to keep the engine hot. That was the main thing, keep steam up, keep them happy, and that didn't always work, but it helped.
Well, Jack, we've had a wonderful time this afternoon, talking to you about some of your memories down on the 3rd subdivision, and it's been a really just a great time. So if anybody's got any questions, now would be the time to submit them. Otherwise, we're going to start wrapping up our program for today and talk about some of the things we'll be doing in the future.
Jonathan, we actually have a couple questions in.
Great, Robert, take it away.
Okay. This question comes from Nicholas from Tacoma. It says, hi, Jack. What was it like changing from steam locomotives to diesel locomotives?
Well, steam engines, you were busy. And the diesels, when they first came, of course, they had their problems. And in some ways, the steam engine, in a way, was quieter. And when we first got the freight diesels, of course, they had alarm systems. There were several things that happened on a diesel. The ground relay, an overall trip to the ground relay alarm would ring. If you were in 5 or 6 throttle, the engines would stop. If you were in other throttle position, they just go to idle. Well, the fireman had to go back, find out what was the matter, reset the ground relay if necessary, or it might be overspeed trip for some reason. The early diesels had a lot of little problems. And in the 60s, we got we went from the FTs to the 3s and 6s and 7s and the F9s. They had less trouble, but they still had problems. You had to go back, and going up the mountain and on the throttle is in run 8 on an F9, the decibel level was enormous. And we didn't have any earplugs. I'm sure the tinnitus that bothers me to this day, I got it going back in those engines. So they used to call it feather bedding, but there was aspects to being a fireman on a diesel were not so hot. But on the other hand, it was a pretty easy job most of the time. And of course, most engineers let the fireman run the engine half of the time. Well, why not? Why have the stress of managing slack and tonnage and rules when you could go over there and eat your lunch and watch the other guy do it? But steam engine, you were both busy. Ordinarily on a steam engine, the fireman watched the water level.
And Jack, what about the time when you were firing that steam engine and you looked over and the engineer was gone?
Well, that was, that was Ed Walters. He was a crackerjack engineer. He used to handle VIP trains for the company. We were on night crew 5 from Tacoma to Seattle, chugging along up toward Auburn. No engineer over there. I looked over and reflecting in the headlight glow, he was hanging on to the grab iron, looking down at the running gear with the cylinders. Hadn't said anything to me, but like I say, to get back on the steam engine,
yeah,
the firemen, most of the time, the firemen handled the water if possible. With a lot of the W3s had what they call a coffin feed pump, and that was put on the engineer's side. So the engineer, beside his other duties, had to watch the water level. And on the A engines, our 2600 support and 401 and 2 had the exhaust steam injector, which worked off back pressure, which was dependent on the setting of the reverse lever. So the engineer controlled that. You had a back pressure gauge along with your other air gauges. So you had to work the, as we use the phrase, work the water from the engineer's seat. So that was an extra duty, which made it nice, a nice job for the fireman on an oil burner. He didn't even have to monitor the water level. Now the Timken had, the 2626 had injectors, of course, so the fireman handled the water on that. Wherever they had 2 injectors, generally the fireman handled the water if he was capable. And water level was very important. I don't know how many of your people understand, and some of you guys probably know more about these than I do, but you had to keep the water level high enough to clear the crown sheet, the top level of the firebox, keep it cool or from melting. You had to keep it low enough so it didn't get up through the throttle. And it's only about 24 inches between the top of the crown sheet and the throttle valve. So it was about the water glasses that we had were about 1 foot long, and they were mounted right in the middle of that space. And you had engineers that liked high water and engineers that liked low water. It was important to monitor that water level. So,
and they would tell you that I want the water level lower, I want the water level higher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the same thing. In the same way of firing a steam engine, of course, the hand fired was a lot of work, but most of the engines fired pretty well. Then they're pretty easy to do. Now, when the grade area went up from 43 square feet in the pre-World War I to 70 square feet. For instance, the Class W engines, the early Ws were 43 square feet of grade area. W3s jumped to 70 square feet and a much bigger boiler with the same length of locomotive. They tried them without stokers, and they ended up having 2 firemen and finally, eventually equipping them all with mechanical stokers or oil burners. So, but steam engines were labor intensive, but it was still fun, and it's certainly less damage to your ears.
Interesting. Robert, more questions?
Yeah. So Jack, the next question comes from Joseph from Nevada. It says, Jack, if you could still run trains today, would you do it?
Yeah, I wish I could do working right now. I worked, you know, we maxed out the pension at 70. I quit at 73. I was handling distributed power trains over the hill, the Ellensburg. He'd pull in the inner bay yard and some switch engine guy would say, retire, retire. You know, I was number 1 for 2 years, and everybody wants that job, I guess. But yeah, I missed it a lot. I missed the action, and I think a lot of us, you know, we had a 70-year retirement for a while. Unions got it. Reagan did away with it. I don't know what you think about Reagan, but I give him credit for that, if nothing else. They got rid of mandatory retirement. But we had a lot of men that were forced out at 70, and they didn't, one of them I'm sure led to early death, but they were not happy because there's something about it. I say in the little book that I've got out, truth to tell, there's nothing like it in the world. Nothing.
That's awesome, Jack.
I'd do it for, I'd pay the, I'm surprised they paid us at all, even didn't ask us to pay them.
Jack, we have another question. This question's from Nate Shedd, who lives north of Seattle. That says, hello, Jack. My question is, what do you think when seeing rail lines that you operated on being gone or abandoned in the modern era of railroading?
Well, Gary Tarbox and I, we had what they call the NP bikers. We rode a lot over these lines, you know, like Snohomish to Arlington, and well, up north almost to Lake McMurray, then Blacktop. And I tell people, you know, I used to fire engines over this. I think it's kind of sad in a way. Our North End had some wonderful jobs, the 675 to Sumas. I look at the trestle down at Bellevue, they're still trying to get that upgraded for bicycles. But it is kind of sad that I think we've got a car culture, a rubber tire culture now. And it's really sad that these branch lines are gone. And I, for one, I'm really happy to have lived when I did, because I think it's really sad that these lines are gone. It's fortunate that short lines have taken over in many cases. But for that matter, I guess I'm glad I'm done with in that respect. But I think it's a sad thing. And I think it's really bad that after all, they've got a 4-to-1 advantage moving freight over the rubber tires. It's really kind of sad that we've torn up so much track, and some of it's being restored, and I think more will be restored in the future.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Austin Jensen from Onalaska, Washington. Is what was your opinion on the early General Electric diesels?
Depends on what GE diesel you're talking about. We talking about U25s, U28s?
Sure.
Well, the trucks on them were kind of rough riding, but they were real luggers on the mountain. And I think Mr. Shannon, our chief mechanical officer, he liked them. Later on, when we got the U33s, they had a truck similar to the SD45 truck, a real smooth riding truck. And I thought they were ideal. I was road foreman of engines in Minneapolis when the U33s were brand new. We were breaking it in. I thought they were the ultimate. But as far as the early GE engines, the road engines, they were real luggers and they were kind of rough riding. And I think it was mostly due to that particular truck. Once they got that to change on the U33s, they were, I liked them. Most of the engineers preferred the EMDs. The U-boats of course, they were 4-cycle engines too, but, and they had an excellent cooling system. You couldn't get them to run hot. They're very good.
Okay. Our next question comes from Alec Bergstrom. This is, Jack, what was your favorite locomotive, either locomotive number, if you had a specific favorite, or a type, and then what made it your favorite locomotive to operate?
Well, I don't know about running them. Firing them, of course, the 2194 was, I made my first trip as a fireman on number 2's helper with, and it was a good steamer. It was a 1910 Pacific, good steamer. I got to run it on the connection for Max King. He would run it when we didn't have any passengers, or when we had passengers, he'd run it. When we dead ended out to East Auburn, pickup number 5, I could run it, and he'd run it when we had passengers. It was pretty smart on his part. But outside of that, all in all, it's steam or diesel. I don't know, these modern ones with a desktop, they're wonderful engines, these 944s. Of course, you got television monitors and everything, and super engines. I don't know, but as far as I mentioned once before, we really like the SD40s as far as the diesels are concerned, freight train. As far as Amtrak is concerned, the four-axle, with the 200s and 300s. What were they? I can't think of.
F40s, I think.
F40, yeah, FP40s. They were a wonderful engine to ride. Very, I think, a lot better than the engines Amtrak's using now. But those particular ones stick in my mind as being very pleasant. I was able to hold passenger during the 80s until Amtrak took over. Those FP40s were wonderful engines, very comfortable.
Okay, next up we have a question from Trent Stetz. It says, Jack, your watercolor paintings are excellent. How do you get the great pipe and valve and gear detail in the paintings of the steam locomotives?
Well, in a wall chart, of course, if the radius rod is down in the lower level of, if you're familiar with wall chart gear, it's got a link, curved link. And the radius rod, when it's the middle of that link at the fulcrum, there's no travel at all. When it's down in the lower level, it's in forward motion. And when it's up in the upper quadrant, you're in rear motion. The reason they did that is some of the linkage should fail at a drop when you're running it. Ordinarily, it'd be, when you're going really fast, to be going forward. So all it would do would put you in a lower gear. It wouldn't put you in reverse if the link broke. The reverse was upper, and you have to understand gear. Baker valve gear was a bell crank leverage. That's a little more complicated. Stevens valve gear was in between, of course, wasn't even visible. But yeah, it helps. There's a lot of great artists out there, a lot better than I am, but I think I know what I'm painting a little better because, you know, I know what it was all about. I do a lot of painting for Foss Maritime. They have a calendar contest every year. I've been entering it since 1985. I've been rejected 8 years, but I've been in it otherwise. And you're allowed 2 paintings. Only once or only twice they've taken both paintings, but I've been in their calendar about 28 or 9 times. And so I've done a lot of studying of tugboats, I believe me. And the Foss Maritimes, it's a fine out. They're kind of like the railroad, you know, big tonnage, 24/7 operation. They're worldwide, not just continent wide. A big muscle bound outfit, you know, heavy hitters. And I imagine I'd be very happy to be very proud to be a part of Foss Maritime if I was so inclined. But kind of like the railroad, you know, a lot of action. Yeah, I try to be careful about detail on locomotive paintings. I'm working on a Great Northern one now. I'm doing research on their super mics. They had 3390s. So I'm working on that. You have to study everything though.
This will be the last call out for questions. If you have any questions for Jack, please send them in the chat feature now. I'm going to try to get to a couple more. One we have left in the queue now, but then I think Jonathan may have 1 or 2 follow-up questions. This is from John Fuji, who says, during steam days, was Portland, Oregon an easy town to work into or out of, or were there any issues or tricks you needed to pay attention to when you were operating there?
Or over the SPNS? Yeah.
Well, either that or into Portland into Union Station.
Well, not particularly. John, by the way, is one of my favorite people. He's a big fan of the W3, and he's a patron of my artwork too, by the way. But no, I think we call the last track in the Portland was the Terrible 10 because the SPNS, they kind of regarded the NP and the UP or the Great Northern as interlopers, you know, on their railroad. And He had to contend with their transfers and dealing with them, but ordinarily, going down there on a freight, you set out at Lake Yard, and then in the 90s, we had a train called 111 that ran all the way down to Brooklyn Yard, about 6 miles south of Portland, and that created additional problems. They finally decided we had a freight pool on the BN, of course. There's no more GN or NP. We were all one big happy family, which was nice. There was no divided seniority or anything. We were all in one. But this train, they were having trouble making it on 12 hours because they'd cut the hours down in the 70s from 16 to 12. So they decided to have 3 crews dedicated to that train, down on train 111 and back on a pig train the next morning. That made for a deluxe freight train job because you had regular hours instead of odd hours, because they could run freight trains at any time, of course. So that I was able to hold that train, and of course you had to get. There was a heavy train that picked up at Tacoma and Longview Junction, and then you had to get all the way to Brooklyn Yard, set your train out, and get your power back to Portland. So the dedicated, they weren't making it 12 hours, so they had a dedicated crew. They gave you some perks, double meal allowance, and full pay for deadheading. So I was able to hold those 3 crews. As you know, the terrible wreck we had in 1993, head-on collision with UP at Longview Junction. I was on vacation, and it was the conductor and brakeman on my crew who were killed in that wreck. But getting through Portland, it was a challenge. Practically all the trains set out at Lake Yard. You very seldom had much for Portland except on 111.
Okay, our next question comes from Bill Keebler, who says, who was your favorite engineer to work or to fire for, and why?
Oh boy, there's such a list. Paul Roselle was my mentor. He took me on, when I made student trips, I went with him. I was able to fire. He got me started on train 402. When he decided to let me run the engine, he'd say, well, it's a dirty trick to play on the passengers, but come over here and take over in your usual incompetent manner. But his idea of a joke. But there was a guy named Ed Hurley who died kind of young. I don't think he ever collected pension, but I fired for him up north on the Everett turn, and he taught me to brake on Maltby, how to do something that was illegal, brake on the humps. It's kind of complicated to explain. In other words, to work the air brakes on a downhill to maintain a level of braking effort. So Ed Hurley was a favorite. I guess it's hard to pick out between, there were quite a number of them, and they were all pretty great guys, you know. Everybody had their strong points. So I don't know. I guess Ed and Paul would be the two. You know, Paul, he was a 1912 fireman. He didn't get promoted until 1942. So I guess that's it.
Next up, our next question is from Robert Stevenson, who says, what type of signaling did you think was best? Semaphore, target, train orders, etc.
Well, when you have a signal arm, you had a day signal, that helped. Going down from Tacoma, we had color light signals as far as Tenino. For some reason, there were 3 lights. They weren't quite as powerful as a searchlight, single light they got, but they were semaphores from Tenino south. I remember that in the early days. course, on the branch lines, they were dark, and you just had to go by train order.
Okay, we have, I think that's our last question. Jonathan may have one, but I do have one question to follow up for you. Can you tell us briefly about the Nelson Bennett Tunnel and what you knew about when it went from double track to single track?
Well, I know when they started getting high cars, I believe they did tried to do a little surgery on it to keep the double track. But when now they didn't go to centralized traffic control till after I came back from Montana in 1972. But apparently the high car thing was still a problem. So when they went to centralized traffic control, they just made the Nelson Bennett Tunnel a single track to take advantage of the arc of the masonry in the tunnel, so they could run the high cars through there. And I guess it's not much of a problem. Sometimes you had to wait your turn there. And I guess it's still in effect today.
Okay, that is all of our questions we have in the queue. I'll turn it back over to Jonathan. Thank you.
Jack, the last question I've got for you is, what's the painting behind you?
Well, I just brought that upstairs. That's an old acrylic, one of the few acrylic. It's kind of not exactly fictional. It's the couple standing at the depot in Acme, which is just north of Wickersham on the line to Sumas. At one time, we had passenger trains up to Sumas, long before my time. But the picture depicts a Class W 1500 taking water. There was water at Acme. So the brakeman's up there taking water, and the fireman's poking out the pan. And I don't know if it's the old Class W. I don't know if it's got a stoker or not, probably hand fired. The W's were built in 1905 and 6, Mikado style. They were one of the best engines we had.
I know it's out of the area, Jack, but could you, before we go, could you just tell us the story about the hand firing incident up to Sumas?
Well,
remember you had that guy that just said the firemen were just slacking off?
Well, Max King has got the story. I'm not sure if it wasn't in the Main Street. It's called The Fireman's Friend. And John Fuji, I think, has the original manuscript, which I gave to him because he was a W3 fan. When the W3s first came, they didn't have a stoker. They had a number 5 scoop. And the earlier W's were 43-foot grade areas, and the W3 had a 70-foot grade area with a bigger boiler, same length locomotive, same driver size and everything. But the management thought that they didn't need a stoker. And the firemen were having a hell of a time keeping, they were talking a lot of strike talk. And they finally sent a new road foreman out to demonstrate that he could do it. And the engine, it was on the Sumas run up to Sumas, 139 miles. And they've been having failures because of the firemen, and they were finally decided to put 2 firemen on. I know that much is true, that they did try 2 firemen. But according to the story, this road foreman was going to prove that he was in top physical condition. Max King was the fireman for a crabby old engineer. Max was just an extra man, but this crabby engineer, they were going to have a demonstration, little extra tonnage. And so this engineer, this official, he was going to be the fireman. So they start out and he's doing his work, and pretty soon he's getting a little bit tired, and Max is going to get to take water at Woodinville, and all the engineers said, "No, you're not going to do that work. He's the fireman, let him do it." Every time Max would try to help, the old engineer he finally told Max, says, "Are you a friend of this guy? Let him stew in his own juice. He's challenges." Well, it turned out that they got as far as Sagrewully, and the arrogant official was just washed. He was completely washed out. He was unable to even go to take water. They needed to take water and clean it. And so he let Max take over. Of course, he was still fresh. He'd been sitting on the fireman's seat box all night. So when the road foreman reported the master mechanic, he says, you got to have stokers on those engines. Now, this may be a fictional tale, I don't know, but I know that the W3s were, I think by the end of the 1920s, the coal burners were equipped with duplex stokers, and of course, there's 16 of them were in oil. And it makes for a good story anyway.
Oh, it sure does, Jack. But you know what? I would just have to tell you, this whole get-together has made for a good story. And I hope that you've had as much fun as everybody else has here. Could I ask you to come back and we do this again sometime?
Well, I won't dare, like Eric Hoffer, the longshoreman philosopher that was so popular back in the 80s, says a lot of the things I did when I was young, maybe I didn't, but I thought I did. But I try not to be too fictional. Yeah, there's enough out there. One thing about the railroad, you really don't have to make anything up. It happened.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Well, thank you, Jack. I've just got a few slides to wrap up our presentation for tonight, folks, so bear with me for a second. First, I wanted to make sure that we gave credit to Jack and to Robert and Gary. You know, Gary has been here the whole time. Gary, you know, put this PowerPoint presentation together and has spent endless hours with Jack and I working on this presentation. And of course, Robert, who's just been instrumental in this project. Thank you to all of you for your participation in tonight's event. We also want to thank our sponsoring organizations. We can see those on the screen: Pacific PNRA, NPRHA, the Virtual Rail Fan Groups, and of course, For Culture, our cultural funding agency for King County. And as I've said, thank you very much for attending. And if you've got any questions or comments or concern, or please, if you're interested, if you wanted to give us some feedback and comments, your feedback and comments are welcome at info@pnraarchive.org. And on that happy note, I'm going to say thank you to our guest, Jack Christensen, to Robert for his help, and for everybody that took time out of their schedule to attend this event. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Good night, everyone.
Good night.